Med stemmer fra 3 kontinenter vil vi høre mer om fremtidens energimarked. For å lede samtalen, ønsk velkommen til Thommessen fra Responsibility.
Jeg tror vi skal ha de andre på her også. Jeg tror det eneste som mellom oss og lunsj er dere. Eller omvendt, vi det eneste som mellom dere og lunsj. Så jeg tror det, you guys have to come.
You're not going to have a panel on your own?
Well, thanks to all 3 of you for, I think, really interesting introductions and perspectives to the global challenge and opportunities. And we've been speaking quite a bit about policies. But of course, policies shall again turn into investments, so money talks. And I would like to speak a little bit about money. And Peggy, you gave a fantastic picture of what's happening in China and what's going to develop over the next few years. If you look at the hard numbers, 2015 globally was a record year in renewables. But the maybe most impressive record was that China, for the first time, passed $100 billion in investments. That's more than 1/3 of all the renewable investments in the world. And this may not be something that you think about, but for the rest of us, that means that you are a superpower, a gigapower.
So, yeah, gigapower.
Gigapower, right? So that means it's a little bit like in the Kremlin, when they cough in the Kremlin, they get pneumonia in Siberia, right? So what we are wondering about is, what is the agenda of China? And let me introduce the question to you with a critical assessment. There are critics of your solar industry, because critics would say that the very impressive development of solar, which of course have benefited the world in terms of lower costs and benefited consumers, that it has been heavily subsidized by cheap finance, which again have caused some trade wars, for example, with the US. All of these create market distortions. That's the problem. So what we are worried about is, do China
Hal is already shaking your head, by the way, his head. So, I mean, if you're worried about like unfair competition, I mean, I'm an engineer. I believe that and from Silicon Valley, so I believe that early technologies, especially ones that are going to save our asses, we have to subsidize them, and we have to help them cross the chasm. But if you're worried about, is China trying to do this for selfish reasons versus selfless reasons, I would say that in regards to money, everything has to start with self. I would say that for behavior change, we have to really change all of our vocabulary to understand that behavior change starts by helping people figure out how it benefits themselves. However, I would like to point out another example of what's happening. I mentioned One Belt, One Road. And this is a great example of how China is already convening. I wouldn't say leading. That's not a word that I think China is ready for yet. I think superpower is not a word that Chinese people are comfortable with, but I would say a convener is something that they are willing to step into. And so if you look at OBOR, it's a terrible name. We really need to get some more branding experts in China. But One Belt, One Road is, $40 billion for Silk Road Fund, $100 billion for the BRICS New Development Bank, $100 million for, $1 billion for the AIIB. Right? $1 trillion. So, I mean, it's going to require $2 to $3 trillion of investment across this entire landscape. And China is doing this, yes, to make sure that its goods can get out, right, so it can trade.
That's really the question. Can we trust that you have a global climate agenda, not only a Chinese agenda? Is that because you are important, critically important?
Hal, can you step in?
Let me offer some thoughts on that. First of all, if the Chinese government wants to pay to decarbonize the American power system, I'm completely fine with that. That's not a problem. So pour on the subsidies.
Actually, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, I think, is richer, right?
Well, they are.
We should knock on their door here. We're here.
Anyway, no, I think the Chinese have made renewable energy, clean energy, a strategic pillar. It used to be automobiles. those haven't gone away, but increasingly it's
going
the
to
technology.
EVs and self-driving.
But there is one important asterisk, which is a scary one, which is Chinese overseas development aid, the China development banks and the Chinese exploitation. So China is reforesting its country like crazy while it deforests in Myanmar and Thailand and so forth. And so there's and of course, the same in Africa. So the standards which are evolving for internal Chinese decision-making with respect to the environment have not translated into their export-oriented finance. At least that's my impression.
Well, I think it's going to be 50 years of working together with smart people, collaboratively, to make sure we get all the pieces right. But I do think that the intentions are there, and it's certainly more than other countries are necessarily doing to have regional prosperity.
Right.
Because one of the challenges globally today, of course, is that we have plenty of capital in principle in OECD and China, but then we have very little capital in Africa and other emerging markets. What's your advice? What's the single policy change that should happen?
Let me build on Akin's presentation because it was so terrific. If you set the policy conditions properly, capital flows. And if you look at, renewable energy is all capital cost, right? And no operating costs. Small exaggeration. Capital costs are driven largely by interest rates. High interest rates will double the cost of any project in the renewable energy sector. Interest rates are driven by risk. There are half a dozen risks that are controllable by government policy. And some of these I laid out already. If you have a pre-cooked power purchase agreement for your wind or your solar energy, and you have some contract sanctity, and the government can bond these things, then that whole pricing risk evaporates. If you pre-zone where the wind and solar farms are allowed, then siting risk evaporates. If you have a transmission hookup protocol that's across the board, then that risk evaporates. If you have environmental permitting that if it meets certain standards, you get a permit in 90 days, then the timing risks go away. So it's possible through good policy to pave the way.
You actually gave a whole menu of the right policies for Africa in order to attract foreign investment.
Well, I just was stealing from Akin's presentation.
Akinwole, you gave also a very opportunity-oriented, but still, problematic presentation. And one of the challenges in Africa, as already discussed, is despite the huge opportunities, despite both technology opportunities, despite success in rooftop solar distribution, still foreign investments are skeptical. In your opinion, two questions really. What do you think it takes? Of course, you said something about it in your speech, but what's the single most important thing that it takes to create
thanks.
interest?
I don't think there's a silver bullet, and I don't think there's one thing that you can do. It's got to be a collection of things. But one of the perspectives that we have in terms of doing business in Africa is that there needs to be deep engagement with the private sector in Africa, the real private sector. The entrepreneurs who are doing real business in real communities. That's number one. And there's a place for the government. So the government in Norway, for example, since they are a wonderful host here, could support very good conversations with chambers of commerce of countries of interest, and they could promote and encourage investors from Norway, for example, to have this sort of meetings, this iteration with the investing public in Africa. And I think that the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenge, of course, beyond the political risk and so on, because now you have instruments to hedge against political risk. You have MEGA. If you say that's going to take you a while, we have the African Trade Insurance. Anything south of 100 million euro, they're very good for it. They would guarantee and protect you against most sovereign risk, contract termination risk, payment risk. And of course, you have instruments against currency inconvertibility. So most of the risk that typically would keep people away have been identified, and a lot of these have been de-risked.
But then the next question is, you're a successful African businessman, you are on these scenes. But the truth is, there are not that many African businessmen on these scenes. I'm investing in Africa, I know Africans, and my question is a little bit provocative. What do African entrepreneurs and companies have to do themselves to become more attractive. Do you have some
No,
thoughts on
true.
that?
And this is the point. So the point is that the OECD countries, China less so because China is a bit more agreeable into the African inefficiencies. But I suspect that for a lot of African entrepreneurs, they still don't understand how the West do business. So for example, there's so many private enterprise who don't understand that you can't go around with bags of cash bribing government officials. It's just not going to happen. So, and they don't understand what you're talking about. Yeah, but I just gave him money. It's no big deal. So I think that, again, it's about interaction. You can't school anyone beyond doing. So the more the Western businessmen can act as mentors, and I hope my African brothers and sisters can forgive me if I say that, but the more you can have this mentorship, this partnership, that you need to hold the hands of the locals, the serious locals, the more you can get more business done.
Peggy?
I think that's a great opportunity to talk about what China is doing, specifically a friend of mine named Helen Hai from the World Economic Forum. She was asked by the president of Ethiopia just a few years ago to open up a shoe factory, just serendipitously out of a meeting. And she went there the first year, she created 2,000 jobs. By the second year, 3,000 jobs. Now she is putting $2 billion to work in Africa, making unemployable employable. And she's now advising 7 countries in Africa to create economic development zones. So I think that, like you said, getting in there, making jobs, and then with that, by bringing in the China model for light manufacturing, we have the opportunity to follow with things like solar and wind and all this green buildings, et cetera. Dai Zikang, who is one of our advisors, he's a developer. He is building, I think he's putting $15 billion into a city in Johannesburg to create the New York City of Africa, right? And it's going to be all green. Now, China, by 2030, is going to move 85 million light manufacturing jobs out of China. Where is it looking? Some in Southeast Asia, but there's, frankly, there's not enough people there. Where is it looking? In Africa.
I got to ask one question about Europe. You're all from different continents in Europe, but we need some help in Europe. Why? We had the boom and bust of the solar subsidized industry in Germany, Italy. And the truth is, investors have been bleeding. Europe is down 60% in investments in renewable from its peak, down 20% last year. Hal, to you maybe, what does it take to improve investor confidence in Europe?
So the German experiment is confounding. So I think Germany did a great thing by overpaying because it created a global option. And what I say to my German friends is, you did more with your feed-in tariff for overseas development than all your overseas development budgets for all time, right? Because you created a zero carbon option for the world. So think of it as you bought the price down, you didn't buy a bunch of energy. The problem with Germany from my perspective, and I use Germany as archetypical because it's the biggest example, is they have 4 huge policies, none of which were built with respect to each other. They deregulated the utilities for economic reasons. They relied on the European trading system to reduce carbon, but it's totally mal-designed, so it doesn't do the job. They created a feed-in tariff without creating a transmission network or pricing system to go with it, so they're stranded wind, and they have a cap rather than a floor on renewables, and they decided to shut down their nuclear plant. Those are huge policy instruments, none of which was decided with respect to each other, and none of which are driving carbon down, right? So they have to get to the main point, which is CO2 per kilowatt hour and kilowatt hours per capita, and everything else is noise right now.
Hal, you get the punchline. Thanks for joining us for this important session. As I said in the beginning, we're the only thing between them and lunch.
We have to leave before there's a riot.
We got to go.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.